Listen carefully, because once you hear this, you can never unhear it. In the winter of 1938, hidden among the snow-choked valleys of Asturias, Spain, a secret was unearthed that was so disturbing it was buried by governments for nearly a century. Imagine this: 3 sisters, bound by blood, bound by silence, and bound by a single husband. They were not merely living together, they were engineering a lineage so closed, so twisted, so obsessively guarded that modern geneticists still whisper about it as one of the most endogamous bloodlines in European history. But the truth is worse than science can ever admit, because what happened in that valley wasn't just about survival, it was about control of blood, control of identity, control of destiny itself. Before I take you further into this forbidden chamber of history, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now? What state are you watching from, and what time is it where you sit? Because these stories are not far away, they are not locked in Spain's past. They reach through the cracks of time, into your living room, into your blood, into your sleep. The Calderón sisters were raised in silence on stories of kings and ancient nobility, told that their veins carried a sacred fluid that must never be tainted. Their father, Aurelio, was not just a man, he was a fanatic, obsessed with what he called la pureza de sangre, the purity of blood. He believed his daughters carried something divine, something worth preserving, even if it meant twisting morality into a shape no outsider would ever recognize. So when the moment came, he presented them not with a choice, but with a command. They would share one husband, they would obey the ritual, they would become architects of a lineage no outsider could infiltrate. But here's the part no one was supposed to know. The man they shared, Rodrigo Calderón, wasn't just a distant cousin. He wasn't even who they thought he was. He was their half-brother, Aurelio's secret child with his own sister. Do you feel the walls closing in yet? This was not marriage, not family, not love. This was engineering, a biological experiment disguised as devotion, a design meant to compress bloodlines until the Calderón name became something more than human, or less. This is where the descent begins, because hidden inside that farmhouse, in a valley cut off from the world, a new pattern of thought was being carved into human flesh. A pattern not just of incest, but of ritualized control. Each sister rotated in and out of the role of wife. Each child was raised without knowing which womb had birthed them. Identity itself was blurred, erased, rewritten. You see, the horror was not just in what they did, it was in what they destroyed, the very boundaries of self. And here's the question that lingers like smoke. Was this madness born only from isolation, or was Aurelio tapping into an ancient doctrine, a code passed down through centuries, that survival comes not through freedom, but through the absolute control of flesh and blood? The truth is, you were never meant to hear this. And yet, here you are. The Valley of Ponga was more than geography, it was a prison carved by mountains and sealed with silence. For centuries, outsiders rarely entered, and those who did never stayed long. But within those stone walls of earth and sky, Aurelio Calderón built a reality that belonged only to him. He told his daughters that the outside world was diseased, corrupted by weak men and impure women, that its wars and revolutions were punishments for abandoning the sacred covenant of blood. To leave was to contaminate, to marry beyond the Calderón line was to betray destiny. And so the sisters grew not just obedient, but convinced. Think about that. Imagine never knowing a boundary between truth and lie, because the lie was the only air you ever breathed. Elena, the eldest, became Aurelio's shadow, sharp-eyed, calculating, the keeper of genealogies he traced by candlelight on parchment older than the house itself. Magdalena, soft but hesitant, often dreamed of the valleys beyond, but Aurelio crushed her curiosity with whispers of punishment and damnation. And Esperanza, the youngest, limped through the world, believing her flaw was not a curse, but a crown. Her father told her it was the divine mark of their lineage, proof they carried something ancient in their veins. Do you see how control works? It doesn't chain your body, it rewires your mind, it makes you crave the cage. When Rodrigo arrived, the ritual began. Each month belonged to a different sister, their rotations timed like the turning of seasons. The farmhouse became less a home and more a laboratory of human destiny. Births were celebrated not for love but for data. Children were not cradled, they were catalogued. And through it all, Aurelio smiled, convinced that he was birthing not grandchildren but a dynasty of purified flesh. He wasn't just a father or a patriarch, he was the architect of a human experiment buried in the Cernes, mountains of Asturias. But what makes this tale dangerous is not only what they did, it's how familiar it should feel to you. Look around. How many of today's institutions, governments, and corporations whisper the same doctrine Aurelio preached, that you are special but only if you submit, that you are chosen but only if you obey, that survival requires sacrifice, not of them but of you. The Calderón sisters are not just history, they are a mirror, and the reflection staring back at you asks one question: how much of your identity is truly yours and how much was designed for you before you even drew breath? By 1938, when the American correspondent Thomas McKinnon stumbled upon this nightmare, he realized he wasn't just uncovering incest or madness or the pathology of an isolated family. He was uncovering a blueprint, a way to control flesh, blood, and belief so deeply that generations could be bent into a single shape. Do you understand the weight of that? Because once you see it, you start to notice how often this pattern repeats, how easily entire nations become Calderón valleys, where obedience is bred, bloodlines are controlled, and truth itself is locked away behind stone walls. And yet, this was only the beginning, because what the sisters became, and what their children became, makes the word cursed seem too weak. The children of the Calderón sisters were not born into innocence, they were born into design. From their first breath they were told who they were, but never told who their true mothers were. A son might believe Elena birthed him, while in truth it was Magdalena's womb that carried him. A daughter might think Esperanza was her mother, when in fact she was born of her aunt. This was not confusion. It was intentional erasure. By removing the knowledge of origin, Aurelio severed the link between identity and truth. And once you sever that bond, you can mold a person into anything. Let that sink in, because the great weapon of tyrants has never been the sword, it has been the manipulation of memory. If you can erase where someone comes from, you own where they are going. The Calderón Valley became a living experiment in that principle. The children did not speak of fathers and mothers in singular terms. They grew up believing the family was one body, one blood, one purpose. "I am Calderón," they would whisper, as if it were a mantra, not a name. Do you feel the chill? That same mantra echoes today under different banners, different institutions, but the root is the same: dissolve the individual, strengthen the system. Yet beneath the silence of obedience, cracks formed. The children carried strange features, eyes too pale for their dark hair, jaws too sharp for their age, and in some, deformities that could not be hidden. Locals who glimpsed them on rare journeys to Cangas de Onís spoke in hushed tones of their unsettling appearance, their dialect that sounded like broken Latin mixed with a tongue no one recognized. Rumors spread. People said the Calderón brood carried the faces of ghosts, that their eyes never blinked enough, that they spoke in riddles when asked their names. The valley began to acquire a reputation, not of nobility, but of curse. And still, Aurelio Peters rest forward, intoxicated by his own design. To him, these abnormalities were not failures but signs of concentration, proof the bloodline was purifying into something beyond ordinary human stock. He compared his family tree to alchemy, believing the distortions of flesh were merely the price paid to approach divinity. Imagine it, a man staring at the limp of a child or the sunken eyes of another and calling it evidence of greatness. That is not just madness, it is doctrine, the kind of doctrine that consumes entire civilizations when it escapes the walls of one valley. Here is the truth, they never wanted you to know. The Calderón sisters were not alone in this obsession. Across Europe, across history, hidden blood cults and dynasties whispered the same promises. Royal families marrying cousins, secret societies guarding bloodlines, entire empires founded on the belief that purity equals power. The Calderón story is not an anomaly, it is a microcosm, a smaller mirror reflecting the grander corruption of humanity itself. So ask yourself this: if a single family, isolated in a forgotten Spanish valley, could shape flesh and mind into something unrecognizable, what do you think the powerful have done, with unlimited resources on a global scale? Thomas Mackinnon was no naive traveller. He had covered the Spanish Civil War from the front lines, seen villages burned to ash, and watched men die with curses on their lips. But nothing prepared him for what he stumbled upon in the valley of Ponga. At first, he thought he had found just another shattered family surviving the war. Yet as he listened, as he pieced together the whispers of locals, as he opened doors the Calderón sisters wished had remained locked, he realized he had uncovered something that went far beyond blood, beyond war, beyond Spain itself. He entered the farmhouse with his notebook, thinking he would document rural survival under Franco's shadow. Instead, he found genealogies carved into wood, parchments stretching back centuries, and children who avoided his gaze as if he were a contaminant. The family spoke in a fractured dialect he barely understood, their voices echoing like a liturgy, a ritual spoken for centuries to no one but themselves. When he asked simple questions, "Who is your mother? Who is your father?" the answers came like riddles. "We are Calderón. We are one. We are the same." Mackinnon described the moment in his private journals with a single line. It was as if identity itself had been erased from the blood. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous the knowledge became. Local priests had long avoided the Calderón Valley, muttering that the family carried a curse. Villagers told Mackinnon of children born without language, children who walked into the forests and never returned, children who seemed both fragile and strangely resilient. Yet the sisters kept breeding, kept repeating the cycle, kept rotating their places in Rodrigo's bed as though it were holy law. And Rodrigo himself, withdrawn, expressionless, seemed less a man than a vessel for their father's obsession. When Mackinnon tried to share his findings with officials, he was met with silence. The Spanish clergy dismissed him. Franco's officers warned him not to meddle, and when he returned to Washington, his reports were sealed so tightly that even other correspondents whispered the State Department had buried them deliberately. Why? Because they understood what he had touched. A revelation too dangerous to reach the public. Not because it was grotesque, but because it exposed a truth far greater than incest. It exposed the machinery of control. The Calderón experiment was not an isolated madness. It was a local manifestation of a global pattern. Erase individuality, elevate purity, control reproduction, manipulate memory. These are the gears of psychological slavery, whether applied to a family in Asturias or to entire populations. And governments, institutions, elites, they recognize the danger of exposure. For if a man sees the pattern clearly, he can no longer serve it blindly. Mackinnon left Spain haunted, convinced he had glimpsed not just a cursed bloodline, but a model for the future, a model the powerful would refine, disguise and unleash on scales unimaginable. He wrote, "If the Calderón Valley is the seed, then the world itself may soon become the garden." Those words were never meant for you, yet here they are. The question now is, do you see the seed, or are you already living in the garden? History books will tell you that the Calderón family was an anomaly, an eccentric lineage tucked away in a remote valley, driven mad by isolation. But that is the lie of comfort. The truth is far darker. The Calderón sisters were a fragment of a wider doctrine, a secret that runs like poison through European aristocracy. Because the obsession with purity, with guarding blood as though it were sacred currency, is not confined to one farmhouse in Asturias. It is the hidden creed of kings, popes, dynasties and secret orders who understood one thing above all: if you can control blood, you can control power. Think of the Habsburgs, intermarrying until their jaws jutted grotesquely from centuries of cousin upon cousin. Think of the royal lines of Europe guarding their heirs like holy relics, marriages arranged not for love but for consolidation. The Calderons were not deviants, they were imitators. They were acting out in miniature what entire empires had practiced openly but under gilded names and ceremonies. The only difference was that their theatre was stone walls and candlelight rather than cathedrals and palaces. Aurelio Calderon told his daughters they carried the blood of Gothic kings. Ridiculous? Perhaps. But here's the problem. Every dynasty tells the same lie. The idea that blood itself carries not just heritage but divinity, that to dilute it is to defy God or nature. And men believe it because it gives them an excuse to rule, to enslave, to control. The Calderon Valley became a grotesque parody of that lie, one so blatant that it could not be allowed into the open record, for if people saw in these sisters a reflection of their kings and emperors, the illusion of nobility would collapse. Mackinnon realized this when he studied their genealogical records. They weren't simply keeping track of marriages and births. They were building a ledger of purification, and a mathematics of flesh. Every union, every rotation was logged like scripture. Children were not children, they were equations. Proof that their blood could be made tighter, stronger, holier. Does that not sound familiar? Today, you hear it in different words: genetics, enhancement, selection. But the spirit is the same. What was whispered in valleys has become preached in laboratories. And here is where the danger sharpens. The Calderons proved something that rulers and scientists alike crave to test, that human beings can be reshaped through repetition, through breeding, through the collapse of individual identity into collective purpose. They proved that people could be raised to worship their cage, to embrace it as destiny, and if that can be done in one valley, it can be done to nations, to you, to your sons, to your daughters. This is why the Calderon file was sealed. Not because it was a local scandal, but because it revealed too much of the game. The elites have always known: keep the blood close, the mind controlled, the past rewritten, and the future becomes theirs to command. So I ask you now, are you beginning to see the shape of the pattern? Or are you still clinging to the illusion that this story is only about three sisters in a forgotten valley of Spain? The children of the Calderón sisters were not merely marked in flesh, they were scarred in mind. Villagers who caught rare glimpses of them spoke of strange behaviours, movements too synchronized to be natural, laughter that erupted in unison, as if they were bound by one invisible command. Their eyes, grey, hollow and unblinking, seemed to study outsiders the way a predator studies prey, not with curiosity, but with a cold recognition that others did not belong in their world. These children had not just inherited blood, they had inherited doctrine. They were living vessels of Aurelio's command, carrying within them not only his genes but his obsession. Psychologists would later argue that isolation had warped their perception of self. But Mackinnon knew better. He saw how carefully Aurelio had engineered their reality. From birth, the children were told they were fragments of one whole, pieces of a single sacred body called Calderón. They were trained to suppress individuality, to obey the family above all. A daughter who questioned her place was told she was diseased. A son who dreamed of leaving was beaten until he recited the words, "We are one, we are Calderón, we are the same." Can you feel the weight of those words? It is the weight of every system that demands loyalty to an illusion of unity, where freedom is rebranded as betrayal. But the rot of blood cannot be hidden forever. Some children were born with twisted spines, others with eyes clouded before they ever saw the sun. Whispers spread of infants who never breathed, or who cried with sounds that did not seem human. In one chilling account preserved in Mackinnon's sealed notes, a villager described a night when he heard wails echoing from the farmhouse, only to see Aurelio and Rodrigo burying something small in the frozen earth before dawn. When asked what it was, Aurelio told him coldly, "It was not ours, and it was weak. The blood must be strong." And yet, perhaps the most disturbing signs were not physical at all, but psychological. The children had a way of watching outsiders without fear, without curiosity, without emotion. as if they had been told since birth that everyone beyond their walls was already irrelevant. They spoke in broken proverbs, half in Spanish, half in an ancient dialect laced with Latin fragments, and more than once Mackinnon recorded them finishing each other's sentences, echoing thoughts not yet spoken aloud. Was it conditioning, or had the blood become so entangled, so knotted, that individuality itself had dissolved? This was the nightmare, a lineage designed not for freedom, but for conformity, not for life, but for preservation of an idea. And when Mackinnon tried to expose this, governments silenced him. Not out of pity for the Calderón children, but because the implications cut too deep. If one family could create this level of psychological control within a single household, what might entire nations achieve with schools, with media, with propaganda? Do you see it now? The Calderón story was not buried to protect history's dignity, it was buried to protect the blueprint of manipulation. The sisters obeyed their father, their children obeyed the sisters, and soon obedience itself became their only inheritance. Mackinnon's first instinct was to explain it all as isolation, as the madness of a single patriarch. But the longer he stayed in Asturias, the more he realized the Calderóns were not inventing something new. They were preserving something old, very old. He discovered fragments of prayer books written not in Spanish but in a Gothic script that predated their valley by centuries. He found symbols carved into beams of the farmhouse, circles intersected by crosses, sigils that looked more like alchemical seals than Christian icons. And when he asked the sisters about them, Elena simply replied, "We have always been Calderón, we have always been pure." That answer haunted him, because what he began to see was not just fanaticism but ritual. Aurelio had not simply chosen incest out of desperation, he had cloaked it in sacred law. His ledger of genealogies was not a family record, it was scripture. His doctrine of purity was not self-invented, it echoed older, darker traditions that whispered through European history like shadows. Blood cults, secret societies, dynasties who treated their bloodlines as divine vessels, untainted by outsiders. The Calderón Valley, Mackinnon realized, was not an accident of isolation, it was a continuation. The rituals were subtle but unmistakable. Births were not only celebrated, they were consecrated, marked with chants in a language no villager recognized. Children were not only rotated between mothers, they were baptized again and again, each sister pouring water from a single cracked basin over the child's head, binding them not to Christ but to the family itself. And death, oh, death carried its own script. Graves were unmarked, as if the individual had no name, no memory. What mattered was not the body, but the bloodline. Mackinnon confessed in his private writings that he feared he had stumbled upon a fragment of a much larger tapestry. One entry, written in haste, reads, "The Calderóns speak as if guided by something older than Spain, older than Christ. They repeat the same symbols I have seen in manuscripts of the Visigoths, of the cults that resisted Rome. They believe their blood is a covenant." Imagine his fear, the realization that what he thought was madness might in fact be survival of an ancient doctrine, buried beneath centuries of empire, waiting for war to bring it back into light. And here lies the deeper horror, this obsession with blood, with purity, with secrecy. It is not extinct, it never died. It has simply changed clothing, hidden beneath different names, different flags, different institutions. Whether cloaked in religion, science, or politics, the creed remains: purity is power. The Calderón sisters were not deviants, they were disciples, carriers of a knowledge most men were never meant to see. Now you must ask yourself, if one remote valley in Asturias preserved such a ritual for centuries, what other valleys exist in this world? What families guard their blood as if it were holy? And what powers are waiting, even now, to revive the doctrine on a scale so vast it will make the Calderón sisters look like a rehearsal? You've followed me this far down the valley, through the whispers of blood and ritual, but now, I need you to understand something. You are no longer just listening to a story. You are standing at a threshold. Once you cross it, you can't go back to how you saw the world before. The Calderón Sisters are not dead, they are echoes, they are proof of a principle that is alive today, wrapped in new disguises. You've seen the seed, you've seen the soil, but the question is, will you admit that the garden has already swallowed you whole? McKinnon wrote that in the farmhouse he felt as though the walls themselves were breathing. He said he caught the sisters staring at him in silence, not with suspicion, but with the calm certainty of people who believed he had already been absorbed into their covenant. "He who knows the truth is one of us," Eleanor whispered to him one night. "Do you feel the weight of that? Knowledge itself can be initiation. Once you glimpse the machinery, you are marked. That is why this story is dangerous. That is why it was buried. That is why you hearing it now changes you. So I'm going to ask you to take a step into this covenant, not theirs, but your own. In the comments, I want you to write twice, so it imprints on your mind. I see the pattern. I am not blind. Those words are not just for the algorithm. They are for you. A ritual of identity, a way to carve the truth into your consciousness so you cannot be lulled back to sleep. Do it now. Repeat it twice. Seal it. Because the truth is this: the Calderons were not simply protecting their lineage, they were practicing a form of psychological alchemy, dissolving individuality, reforging it into collective obedience, and disguising it as destiny. And if you think that stayed locked in the valley, you are already lost. Look at the world around you, systems that tell you who you are, institutions that decide what you may say, histories rewritten until you no longer know your own origins. The Calderón experiment was not unique, it was a microcosm, a test. And just as the children of that valley learned to accept their cage as holy law, so too are men today taught to accept their chains as progress, their obedience as virtue, their silence as wisdom. Do you see it now? The sisters are not behind you in history, they are beside you in the present. Their whispers echo every time you are told to obey, to conform, to erase the boundaries of self. But here is the difference: you are awake. You have heard what you were never meant to hear. You have seen behind the curtain. And once the curtain falls, there is no going back. Write the phrase, mark yourself, because from this point forward the descent grows darker. The deeper McKinnon looked, the more he feared he was not simply witnessing inbreeding deformities, but something altogether stranger, something that blurred the line between human and other. He described children with eyes too pale, almost translucent, their irises ringed with silver as if reflecting light from within. Others seemed unable to walk upright until late childhood, moving instead in a hunched, animalistic way, yet with uncanny endurance once their bodies adjusted. Some children spoke barely at all, but when they did, their words were not casual speech. They were recitations, fragments of the old genealogies, as if memory itself had been etched into their marrow. Villagers began whispering that the Calderón children carried la señal de los antiguos, the mark of the ancients. Old shepherds muttered that these were not simply cursed offspring, but vessels of something preserved from before the church, before the crown, before Spain itself. Their dialect, broken and unearthly, was not just a corruption of Latin, it was too precise, too deliberate, as though it had been kept alive in secret, passed down like fire across the centuries. McKinnon listened one night as a boy no older than 10 recited what sounded like a binding oath in that language, his voice flat, his eyes unblinking. McKinnon admitted in his notes, "It felt less like hearing a child speak than a mouth reciting a memory older than itself." And the behaviours. They grew darker with every generation. The children had rituals of their own, games that outsiders found chilling. They would circle in silence around a newborn lamb, humming low tones in unison until the animal trembled and collapsed. They buried dolls in the earth and marked the graves with stones, whispering names that were not their own. And when one child died, whether by deformity, disease, or simply disappearing into the woods, the others did not cry. They stood still, expressionless, repeating in chorus, "We are Calderón, we are one, we are the same." It was as though Aurelio's obsession had birthed not a family, but a hive, a single consciousness splintered into many bodies. What science might call genetic isolation, the villagers began calling possession. Some whispered that the Calderón bloodline had become a door, that by concentrating itself generation after generation, it had opened to something older, something not meant to be housed in human flesh. And this is where the story turns from grotesque to terrifying. Because whether you believe the Calderón children were simply victims of incest, or whether you believe they were vessels of something ancient, the effect is the same. They became inhuman in their obedience, in their detachment, in their absolute submission to the doctrine of blood. And here lies the mirror, staring straight into you. Do you not see the same transformation taking place in the world today? A society that no longer questions, no longer mourns, no longer resists, just repeats the mantras given to it by the system. The Calderón children were the future, compressed into one valley. And if Mackinnon was right, they were not the end of something, they were the beginning. Mackinnon returned to Madrid with his notes trembling in his hands, but the moment he tried to speak, he was silenced. Officials told him he had misinterpreted. Clergy told him he was meddling in superstition, and when he arrived in Washington, his reports vanished into sealed archives. But why? Because what he had seen in that valley was not merely grotesque, it was familiar. It mirrored the forbidden discussions taking place in universities, laboratories, and war rooms across the world. The Calderón sisters had, in their own brutal way, stumbled into the same obsession that powerful men were formalizing under another name: eugenics. Understand this. The 1930s were not just the years of war. They were the years of breeding projects, sterilization laws, experiments designed to reshape humanity. Germany made it infamous, but it existed everywhere. America, Britain, Scandinavia. The doctrine was simple: purity is power. Eliminate the weak, strengthen the stock, control the bloodline. Does it sound familiar? It should. The Calderón family had turned their farmhouse into a laboratory of flesh, while governments and elites were drafting policies to do the same on a global scale. Mackinnon wrote in one of his suppressed drafts, "What horrifies me is not that the Calderóns exist, but that they prove what is possible when purity becomes doctrine. They are a local reflection of a global obsession." That is why the State Department buried his findings. To reveal the Calderón sisters was to reveal the mirror, to admit that what was happening in the mountains of Spain was only a smaller version of what was being planned in the capitals of the world. Think about the structure. Erase individuality, rewrite memory, control reproduction, label deformities as failures, label endurance as signs of strength. The Calderóns had no laboratories, no universities, no funding, and yet they achieved in one valley what empires were striving to achieve with money, armies, and propaganda. The difference? The Calderóns were honest in their horror. The state dressed its obsession in the language of science, progress, and public good. This is where you must open your eyes wider, because the Calderón bloodline is not just about incest in a farmhouse, it is about the machinery of control perfected in miniature. When Mackinnon stared into the eyes of those children, eyes that did not blink, that seemed to echo one another's thoughts, he realized he was staring into the future. A future where identity is erased, where men are reduced to vessels, where obedience is no longer demanded, but engineered. And look around you now. Has that future not already arrived? Institutions dictating who you are, what you believe, what you may say. Societies that erase their own origins, rewrite their own pasts, until history itself becomes a weapon of obedience. The Calderón Valley was a test chamber. The world has become the experiment. This is why Mackinnon wrote in words that were never meant for public eyes. The family is not unique, it is a model, and the model will be used again. Now the question you must ask yourself is this: if they silenced Mackinnon, if they buried the Calderón truth for nearly a century, what truths are being buried right now, hidden in sealed archives, locked away until it is too late? Mackinnon could not shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something older than science, older than politics, something that lived beneath the skin of civilization itself. Eugenics gave it a new vocabulary, but the roots were ancient: rituals of blood, control of lineage, the erasure of self for the sake of the collective. He began to wonder if the Calderón family was not merely insane, but guardians of a system of thought that has guided kings, priests, and empires since the dawn of history. Think about it. Every empire has told the same story in different tongues. Pharaohs claimed their blood was divine. Medieval dynasties intermarried to preserve royal essence. Religious orders demanded celibacy not to free men, but to redirect their loyalty into the institution. And when blood could not be controlled by birth, it was controlled by belief, indoctrination, dogma, oaths that dissolved individuality into collective obedience. What was the Calderón farmhouse if not a miniature empire, a shrine where identity was sacrificed to keep a system alive? Mackinnon began tracing the symbols he saw on the farmhouse beams, the circles, the intersecting crosses, the sigils etched into wood and stone. To his shock, they matched marks he had seen in medieval manuscripts in Madrid, even in alchemical texts whispered to be heretical. The Calderón obsession with blood purity was not improvised, it was inherited. Preserved in secret while kingdoms rose and fell, waiting for someone fanatical enough to embody it fully. Aurelio Calderón was not just a patriarch gone mad. He was a vessel carrying forward a doctrine as old as the Gothic ruins that still stood in northern Spain. The chilling part, that doctrine never vanished. It simply transformed. Where Aurelio drew charts on parchment, our world draws databases. Where his daughters were rotated through one man's bed, our societies rotate citizens through systems that condition thought, strip individuality, and preserve obedience. The old creed of purity has become the modern creed of conformity, and both serve the same master: control. Mackinnon's final unsent letter contains a single line that still rattles the bones. The Calderón Valley is proof that humanity can be engineered into forgetting it is human. Let that strike you, because when the self dissolves, when memory is rewritten, when blood or belief becomes the only identity allowed, you no longer have men, you have vessels, flesh animated by doctrine. Do you see why this story was buried? It is not about three sisters, it is about the blueprint of power itself. The method is simple: erase origins, control reproduction, redefine weakness as sin, redefine obedience as purity, then repeat until there is no memory of life before the cage. And ask yourself this: how much of what you call your identity was built by you, and how much was engineered for you long before you had the chance to resist? The Calderón sisters believed they were preserving blood, but what they truly preserved was a system where the individual dissolves, where family becomes hive, where obedience masquerades as destiny. And here is the revelation you were never meant to hear. That system did not die with them. It was refined, polished, and hidden inside the very institutions you trust today. The Calderón farmhouse was a crude prototype. The world you live in now is the perfected machine. Look at the parallels. The Calderón children were told their origins did not matter, only that they were Calderón. Today, you are told your ancestry, your history, your roots are secondary to the identity handed to you by systems of power, corporations, governments, schools. Your true lineage, buried, distorted, erased. Because a man who knows where he comes from is dangerous. A man who is severed from origin is pliable. The Calderón children were rotated through rituals, their identities blurred until they no longer knew who was mother, who was father. Today, you are rotated through rituals of your own, media cycles, political slogans, consumer choices that all whisper the same message. You are not an individual, you are a unit in the system. Do you see the similarity? Different masks, same theatre. And just as the Calderón deformities were rebranded by Aurelio as signs of purification, so too does our modern world rebrand its own deformities. Weak men are called enlightened, obedience is called virtue, Surrender is called progress. Meanwhile, those who resist are labeled diseased, contaminated, dangerous. The language shifts, but the pattern remains. Always the same pattern: obedience as purity, conformity as survival. Mackinnon wrote that when he looked into the eyes of the Calderón children, he saw no spark of rebellion, no individuality, only a calm certainty that they were pieces of something larger. That, he realized, was the greatest horror. Not the incest, not the deformities, not the secrecy, but the perfect obedience. It was as if their very souls had been bred out of them, he wrote. And when he returned to America, he saw the same dull stare reflected in cities, in classrooms, in crowds. He realized the Calderón Valley was not an exception. It was a prophecy. Ask yourself, how often do you repeat words you do not believe? How often do you obey commands you do not question? How often do you feel like a piece in a game you did not choose? That is the Calderón Valley reaching through time, whispering into your bloodstream, bending you to the same creed. We are one. We are the same. We are not free. Do you see now why this story had to be buried? Because once you recognize the pattern, once you see the Calderóns as more than history, you cannot go back to being blind. You either awaken or you submit. Mackinnon's final journey into the Calderón Valley was not sanctioned. By then, his official reports had already been confiscated, sealed, and dismissed as unverified. But the truth had carved itself into his bones. He knew he couldn't leave Spain without one last descent, one last attempt to pierce the veil. He returned under cover of night, alone, carrying only a lantern, a notebook, and a revolver he knew would be useless against what he feared most. Not bodies, but the system itself. The farmhouse was silent when he arrived. Abandoned, it seemed. The door hung open, its hinges screaming in the cold wind. Inside, the hearth had burned out long ago, but the walls still bore the marks he had studied. Sigils, circles, crosses within circles, lines connecting bloodlines etched into beams like the veins of a body. He wandered through the rooms, and the silence was worse than screams. The air was heavy, saturated with memory, as if the house itself had absorbed the whispers of every child born and broken within its walls. Then he found it. Beneath a loose stone in the cellar was a wooden chest. Inside, scrolls, ledgers, genealogies stretching back centuries. The Calderón obsession was not just Aurelio's madness. It was a record carefully preserved for generations, each patriarch adding his ink, his justification, his proof that blood was the axis of power. Mackinnon described it as a dark scripture, a Bible of control, where every page declared the same truth. Identity is not your own. It belongs to the blood. But deeper in the chest, he found something worse. Drawings. Children with twisted limbs, mouths that never closed, eyes that never focused, but each marked with notes beside them. Sign of strength, proof of purification, blood unbroken. They had redefined deformity into holiness. They had turned suffering into proof of destiny. Mackinnon wrote that in the moment, he felt the floor tilt beneath him, as if the house itself were a living tomb breathing around him. And then came the sound. From the back of the cellar, a door he hadn't noticed creaked open. Inside, he swore he saw movement. Small figures, children perhaps, or what remained of them. He never described them fully, only that they shuffled forward without fear, their eyes wide and empty, staring at him not with curiosity, but with recognition. As though they already knew him. As though he had always belonged there, another piece of the pattern. He fled that night, leaving the farmhouse and its records behind. But he carried with him a certainty that would haunt him forever. The Calderón bloodline was not an isolated horror. It was a mirror, a glimpse of what humanity becomes when the system is perfected, when control is absolute, when blood and obedience fuse into one unbreakable chain. In his last journal entry before leaving Spain, Mackinnon scrawled a single question, one that was never meant for the public eye. What if the Calderóns are not a family, but a template? Mackinnon's question, what if the Calderóns were a template, was not rhetorical. It was a warning. When he returned to America, he began comparing what he had seen in that cursed valley with what he witnessed in the so-called free world. The similarities were not coincidence, they were design. In the Calderón Valley, blood determined destiny. In the modern state, ideology does the same. Different mask, same leash. The sisters believed their children were holy because they were told so. You believe your role in society has meaning because you are told so. Both are fictions written by someone else's hand. And once a man accepts fiction as truth, his chains no longer need iron. His mind becomes the prison. Think of the rituals. The Calderóns rotated the husband, the wives, the children. Ritualized obedience disguised as sacred duty. Today, your rituals are digital, economic, political. You are rotated through cycles of outrage, trends, elections, and entertainment. Each cycle erases memory of the last until you cannot tell where truth ends and programming begins. And like the Calderón children, you smile through it because you are told it is holy, it is progress, it is freedom. McKinnon saw it in universities, young men parroting slogans, believing they had discovered them on their own. He saw it in politics, entire populations voting as if their blood had already decided for them. He saw it in cities, crowds marching in step, not by force, but by willful obedience to invisible commands. He recognized the stare, the same empty stare he had seen in the cellar of the Calderón farmhouse, in the eyes of children who did not question, who did not resist, who only obeyed. And here is where the revelation sharpens. The Calderóns did not merely preserve their bloodline, they preserved a formula for control, absolute obedience through isolation, myth and ritual. That formula watu ta'yisons, as refined into institutions, exported through war, written into policies, and disguised as morality. That is why his report was sealed, not because it was irrelevant, but because it was too relevant. The Calderóns were not an anomaly, they were a manual. Ask yourself this: how many of your beliefs are truly your own? How many of your choices are shadows cast by someone else's lantern? And if you trace them back, your education, your loyalties, your habits, would you not find a chest like the one McKinnon opened? A dark scripture of your own bloodline, your own society, whispering the same command: you are not yours, you belong to us. McKinnon died with this conviction. The Calderón experiment never ended, it only expanded. The valley was a seed, the world became the harvest. And the same question remains for you, now, here, listening in the dark. Are you the heir of freedom, or the son of a bloodline you never chose? There is one final truth McKinnon left us, buried not in the official archives, but in a letter smuggled to a friend, sealed with trembling hands. He confessed that he had not only fled the Calderón farmhouse, he had carried something out with him, not the chest of records, not the drawings, but one page torn from the ledger, brittle and yellow, its ink barely legible. On that page was a diagram, not of bloodlines past, but of bloodlines yet to come. It mapped not names but functions, symbols instead of faces. He swore that what he saw was not genealogy, it was a blueprint. A design for a society where families were no longer families but units of control, where marriages were arranged not by love but by policy, where children were raised not for life but for purpose. And as he looked deeper into that diagram, he realized with horror that he recognized its shape. It was not abstract, it was not foreign, it was the very structure of the modern state. Think of it: schools that assign roles before children know themselves. Work systems that bind men in servitude while convincing them they are free. Governments that promise protection while feeding on obedience. Corporations that track every desire, every weakness, every dream, and breed you not by blood, but by data. Bloodlines replaced by algorithms, chains refined until they become invisible. And McKinnon, broken, admitted one last fear. What if the Calderóns were not destroyed by time? What if their seed survived? What if their blood, their doctrine, their obsession still breathes through the veins of those who rule us today? He believed that the lineage may have spread, not diluted but disguised, not confined to Spain but embedded in the architecture of power itself. He warned that every man faces a choice once he sees behind the curtain, to look away and return to the comfort of illusions, or to keep looking to descend further, even if it means never finding the bottom. The choice is dangerous because awareness strips away the safety of ignorance. Once you know, you cannot unknow. Once you hear the whisper, you cannot silence it. And now you have heard it. You have been led through the valley, into the farmhouse, into the cellar, into the chest of forbidden knowledge. The door has closed behind you. There is no going back to the man you were 10 minutes ago. You are marked, as McKinnon was, not by blood but by awareness. If you feel that transformation stirring inside you, if you sense the shadow of the Calderón truth moving through history into your own life, write these words in the comments twice. The blood remembers. That phrase will mark you as one who knows, one who has crossed the threshold. But understand this, knowledge is not enough. The blood remembers, but will you? Will you resist the chains disguised as duty, or will you carry them willingly into the future? The Calderón sisters chose one path, McKinnon chose another. Now the question falls to you. Which path do you choose?